Welcome to Radio Omnicol, episode 39. Our guest today in the studio is Dr. Brian Chinsamy. He works in the organization called Leap Leadership and Learning, and also Dr. Hilton Rudnick in the session to discuss leadership and also the concept of why, as a leader, you need to be a good coach. I enjoyed the session a lot. I found the part about listening and the different levels of listening very interesting. And then also the tensions that one holds when one is a leader. And I'm sure you're really going to get a lot of value from the episode. So I hope you enjoy. So welcome Brian and Hilton to the studio today. It's so exciting to have the two of you to chat. Brian, we've been trying to get you into the studio for about 2 years, I think, to have a podcast with you. So we're really thrilled today. How's everything been going? What's been keeping you busy?
Well, thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Hilton, for this opportunity of doing this podcast. I count it a privilege to share my knowledge and experiences. I've been pretty busy recently working with teams across Africa and South Africa. I've been fortunate to have been given some work to do some work with some banks on digital leadership. I've got a large number of requests for coaching, especially spin-offs from my corporate work from individuals who would like their husbands or wives to be coached as well using the Enneagram, and that's been keeping me pretty busy. I've also been fortunate to do some career coaching recently, and interestingly enough, over the pandemic, people have been very interested in where their career is going, and so I've been doing a lot of career coaching for mid-level and senior level ExCo members.
That's fascinating. And Brian, maybe just a brief intro, a little bit about your background, just so that the listeners can get up to speed with who you are.
Yeah, I've got a background in public education. I started off as a teacher, went into the Department of Education in the Gauteng department, and became involved as a researcher on the South African Schools Act. I moved into the parastatal world with, becoming involved with learning with the parastatals in the corporate world, doing learning strategies for APSA. And my first venture into the corporate world, putting in a new learning strategy called LEAP, Learning to Enhance and Perform. I spent some time there and then joined Barclays Africa as the head of leadership, learning and talent for the 12 countries in Africa. And I ended up my career in Barclays Africa. In 2015, I opened up my own organization called Leap Leadership and Learning, and I'm an executive coach and a facilitator for leadership development programs. That's a short summary of my experience.
And certainly we're going to, in the show notes, include a little bit more, Brian, because the amount of qualifications that you've got, one can't even go through all of them now. You're just a lifelong learner, and always enjoy the engagements in our coaching circle, and certainly the clients that experience you as a coach feel very privileged for the information and the growth and the learning that they get. I think today is going to be a very interesting conversation about the work that you do with leaders. And you mentioned something about digital leadership, so I suppose that speaks to that as well. But maybe you can talk a little bit about why you think leaders need to know how to coach.
Good. Let's take a step back. I think I'd like to speak about first the difference between manager and leader, managing and leading. I think that's a good point to start, right? Before we go into why leaders need to have coaching skills. Well, we know management is around coordinating of resources, the interplay between time, money, and quality, that triangle. Managers have to actually manage that triangle, right? Leaders, on the other hand, do something different. They lead people. And leading people is a far more difficult thing than managing time, money, and quality, for example. And the idea of a leader being effective is leading his or her people to enable them to perform optimally. Hence, she needs to coach or he needs to coach the team members and followers. The easiest thing is for a leader to do it herself, but to enable her team members, to get them to help and support them, to see what's preventing them from kind of optimal performance, so that they can take ownership, is what leadership is all about. So when we speak about leaders needing to have kind of coaching skills, I'm always reminded of Lao Tzu. I was an activist in my younger days, and I'm still an activist now, but I always remember this quotation from him: go to the people, live with them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build with what they have. But with the best leaders, when the work is done, when the task is accomplished, the people will say, we have done this ourselves. And that's the mantra for me when I do leadership development and I coach leaders to become coaches with the coaching style of leadership, at least for their teams.
So Brian, I'm wondering if you have, I mean, I think that gave us some insight into like a philosophy of leadership. Do you have like a model of leadership that, or a version of leadership that you kind of believe is generalized to most organizations?
Yeah, Hilton. I've been a firm proponent of finding what has been referred to as the African concept of leadership, right? Because let's be honest, we've been influenced over the large number of years by the plethora of leadership literature coming out from American and kind of from Europe, right? And this Eurocentric concepts of leadership, the trade theory, for example, the strongman leadership. And somehow I've just found in my experience that in Africa, we really look at something different. So in answering your question, I want to speak about two aspects here. Firstly, that leadership is more than just behaviors, right? So we've got the character of a leader, which is those intrinsic characteristics and attributes and values a leader holds. And these are the same for all colleagues and leaders, regardless of what position you hold in an organization. So that's character. The second component is the capability of the leader, those skills and knowledge a leader is expected to hold. And it applies to all leaders. The third component is the conduct of a leader. Those intrinsic characteristics and skills and knowledge are not enough to make you a leader. Leadership must also be demonstrated. So for me in Africa, we need to look at those three: the character, the capability, and the conduct of leaders. But the second component, when we speak about some of these capabilities, we speak about, for example, leaders having commercial decision making, building an effective control environment, driving continuous improvement and innovation, like defining and executing change, enabling high performance, working collaboratively, building relationships, developing others. But the most important one for me is building self-insight. I'm a firm believer that you can't really build a leader as a coach if you don't start with understanding self, having a deeper self-insight, and moving to be a better person overall. So that was the first component, the character, capability, and conduct. The second component is the dilemmas and tensions of leadership. I believe that a leader has got basically, 4 key tensions and dilemmas to balance in his or her life. So firstly, how much of strength do I show my team versus how much of weakness do I reveal to my team? That's a tension, that's a dilemma. And it's a continuum, it's a sliding scale. There's no right answer here for everybody. It's not a cookie cutter or a one size fits all, right? So that's the first dilemma. The second dilemma is how close do I get to my team versus what distance do I keep away from them? The third dilemma, how much are you yourself versus how much do I conform to my team? And finally, how much do I communicate versus how much do I hold back? So you'll see these are tensions that every leader has to hold within himself or herself, and how the leader balances those tensions is what makes him or her effective.
Sure, they're very difficult, Brian. I also am privileged to be a leader, and I think really what I've learned is that it's different for each person that you are leading, right? Those tensions are based on what you pick up from what your employee needs.
Absolutely. It has to be customized. Every single individual is a unique individual. And a leader must look at the individuals in his team and understand what will make the best fit for this particular individual in terms of those tensions. And that is why they move along that sliding scale on the continuum.
So Brian, I mean, I'm wondering when you talk about the kind of African concept of leadership, and if you take a place like South Africa, I guess, which is really a hybrid of I guess, kind of Western corporate culture, but also populated a lot by African leadership. I mean, how do those things collide, or do they work together seamlessly? Do you have to shift one group towards the other? I mean, how do those things play out, say, in like a banking environment?
So those things don't collide, but neither do they work seamlessly, in my experience, right? You've got to be deliberate as a leader in considering the culture of firstly, the organization that you are leading in, but you've also got to consider the culture of the people working in that organization. So here's a good example, right? When as a leader, I need to be in contact with my team. So we teach people as coaches, look, you've got to respect people. You've got to look at them in the eye when you're coaching them. And then I go to Tanzania and I teach coaching with this Eurocentric view of looking at people in the eye. And then a Muslim woman comes to me from Zanzibar in my session and she says, Brian, I'm sorry, but I can't look at this man in the eye because that's adulterous to my husband, right? That's being unfaithful. And I've got to undo all my learning around looking at people and respecting them and say, well, in the Muslim culture, in some countries, looking in the eye is disrespectful for a woman. In African culture, in some African communities, a younger person dare not look at an older person in the eye because that's disrespectful. And so as a leader, you've got to balance out these different tensions, but also make sure that you make them real to the people you are leading. I hope that's given you some idea around some of the tensions in Africa that we've got to contend with, Hilton. So it's not a collision, but it's not a seamless thing as well. You've got to make it, you've got to walk the path as you make it.
So, I mean, is it enough just to make like people aware of the different cultural artifacts and the way they play out? So, for example, if I'm in a very individualistic Western culture frame in an organization and someone's not making eye contact with me, I may not understand. I may see them as being very submissive or not interested or something. Who knows what I'll read into that? Is it just about culturalizing everybody in the environment around the different cultural dynamics, or is it about training people who are different culturally to conform to the model of culture in the organization?
Isn't it both? It's bringing awareness, but it's also awareness, it's the whole awareness to action cycle. It's bringing awareness, getting understanding set in the organization, taking action. A big problem we have in our country, as we have in the world, is not conscious bias, it's unconscious bias. And this is not related to race only, it's related to gender, it's related to language, it's related to age, it's related to so many different aspects of our lives, every single one of us. As leaders, we've got to address that unconscious bias in us. So in my mind, it's got to be a deliberate thing, bringing awareness, but also taking action and sustaining that action. And I think the leader has an amazing opportunity by role modeling his or her behavior of leading a team to transforming their own lives. And it's not going to only help them in the corporate world, it's going to help them in society, in their homes, in their families. It's going to make them better people all around.
So, Brian, when you're looking and you're running your workshops, what are the types of behaviors that signal to you that people have got this insight and self-awareness as a leader?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So firstly, I can speak about the number one thing, especially during the pandemic, right? Compassion. A leader who shows compassion is so noticeable, amongst staff, right? So how compassionate am I as a leader? The second important thing that I notice leaders, all over is how am I creating safety for my team? Simon Sinek speaks of a circle of safety. Recently, we've heard a lot of psychological safety. People are looking for leaders who can create a safe environment for them to discuss things, to debate, to challenge, to ask questions. How safe an environment is the leader making for me? So in terms of behaviors, Hilton, it's around compassion, it's around creating safety. But recently, some research, I think, from Deloitte has shown that it's giving clarity to your staff becomes a key behavioral trait. What kind of clarity am I giving to my staff in terms of this uncertain times, right? And linked to that, is communication. Strangely enough, all of them have those C's: compassion, circles of safety, creating safety, giving clarity, but also communicating. And I think it's in this time, communication is such an important behavioral trait of a leader.
I mean, Brian, I think a lot of the things you're talking about are profound in a way. So, if we're looking as an effective mode of leadership to have compassion and create safety, I mean, we know, of course, that those are good ideas. But in your role of guiding leaders to be coaches, do you find that like some people are just dispositionally not equipped to become a coach? That, for them, their mode of leadership is much more autocratic. That's the way they've been successful. And they just can't shift into maybe the more benevolent forms of leadership that you're talking about.
While on one hand, I believe that coaching is something that you need to be passionate about. It's a calling, right? On the other hand, I firmly believe that every single leader has to have coaching as part of his PD objective. No leader can say, I can escape coaching my team. However, what kind of coaching are we speaking about, right? So, if you look at conversations, if you can just picture on the left-hand side is a very directive conversation, telling people, problem solving, giving people advice, just making suggestions, telling people do this. So that's very directive. On the right-hand side would be like, challenging thinking, listening, asking, more developmental conversations. A leader needs to do both. Needs to have directive conversations and development conversations. Not every occasion requires a coaching intervention, right? So for example, a leader, when there's an immediate crisis, when time is of a predominant criterion, a leader must be able to direct and tell somebody exactly what to do, or do it himself or herself, especially when there's a crisis. However, if the quality of the result matters most, or if maximizing learning is predominant, then coaching comes in, and it's got to be there. So in answer to your question, I would say every single leader needs to have a coaching element in his style, right? But not every leader would necessarily be the best coach. I believe every single leader needs to get involved in what I call skills coaching or performance coaching, right? And if the leader enjoys coaching and can get deeper, then that leader can move into development and transformation coaching. I think it would be very unfair to ask of a leader to move beyond skills and performance coaching to transformational coaching if that is not his passion or her passion.
Brian, I was interested early on in the conversation, you spoke about being an activist, and I was wondering, in terms of your own leadership journey, who's been the leader that you've worked with that has left a profound impact on you?
I've always struggled to find a single person. But I know that many of the things I hold as dear to leaders in different individuals. And I guess we as human beings, we can't contain all of those good things in us, And so I can give you examples of leaders, in my journey, but different people had different skill sets and different things they showed to me what a real leader does. But I can't point to a single individual that had all of these in him. Yeah.
Brian, I wonder how much listening, the attribute of listening and the skill of listening plays a role in your educating leaders. And if it does, how do you skill people up in this area?
Strangely enough, Hilton, I'm busy now with a client. I'm teaching them coaching. And today was the day I took them through listening. And the first thing that you've got to tell people is that, active listening is a skill. It doesn't come automatically to everybody. So you've got to put your hand up and you've got to, be deliberate about saying to yourself, I've got to be able to learn the skill of active listening, right? I'm quite forthright when I say a leader who doesn't listen, you can't call himself or herself a leader, because listening is the number one skill that any leader needs to be able to connect with his or her team. People can find out very easily if you are just doing positional listening. Positional listening is where, you're not really listening to the person, you're thinking about the counter argument, you're thinking about what's the next thing I'm going to bring into the conversation, or you're not fully paying attention to the individual, people will find you out for that. But also, you will trip yourself up because you will not be able to be present and really get the person to get to a solution because you are not listening actively, right? So listening is so important. And I normally say to people, if you can move from positional listening to active listening, people would want to work for you. People would love to be in your team because they can see that you're genuinely interested, about them.
Brian, I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't really have the technical grasp of active listening that you have. I mean, maybe it'll be useful to outline some of the techniques that go into active listening.
Yeah, so, there's so many important things around active listening, right? So one is, just being present in the moment with an individual, right? Giving him or her that space. When we speak about listening, I'm reminded about the 4 levels, and I always use this. So the one is the attending listening. Attending listening is important. You're there, but you're just listening. The second, deeper version of that listening is accurate listening. So I'm listening, but I'm listening for the facts. Okay, I'm listening for those as an investigator would do. So it's a deeper level of listening than attending listening, but it's not as deep as the third level of listening, which is empathic listening. Empathic listening is where I, as the leader, the person who's listening to the person who's speaking, gets the idea that I'm actually putting themselves in their shoes. I understand their reality. I feel their vibe. That's empathic listening. But the 4th level of listening, which is a learned skill, is generative listening. And generative listening comes, the word generate, coming up with something new, genesis. I'm not sure, Hilton, where you've been in a situation, you must have been, you and Colleen, where somebody says to you, Colleen, can you just give me a few minutes of your time? And they speak to you, you are listening. At the end of the conversation, they say, Colleen, thank you so much. You've helped me to resolve this issue. And you sit back and say, but I said nothing. You did the talking. You've done everything. You've been there. You held the space for the individual. You've created the conditions under which this individual can speak. And while the individual spoke, they got an aha moment. Why? Because you did generative listening.
That's true, Brian. And I think what's important now with this conversation is remote working and the whole online digital transition that we're going through, because listening becomes so tricky. You don't know if the cameras aren't on, you don't really know the degree to which people are listening.
Absolutely. That is why some of the ground rules some organizations have put in place is, guys, let's put our cameras on, right? Let's be fair to everybody. Let's put our cameras on, make sure that you're not on your email. Let's make sure that you are not on your WhatsApp chat unnecessarily. Let's give full attention to what's happening. And so what I do in my sessions, I'm quite sneaky in that, I call on people. And I had an interesting thing the other day. The MD was part of this Exco team session. And I called on somebody and the person was quiet and there was nobody answering. And the MD, when later on, the managing director said, so what happened? You were silent. And the person said, I had to rush off quickly to go and fetch my child from the creche. I'm sorry I wasn't on at the time. And it led us into a discussion around, so when people leave, let's go into the chat and say, guys, I'm not going to be available for the next 10, 15 minutes. I've got to pick up my child from creche. I'll be joining you back again. The ethics of online virtual work. And so we started to develop this also in terms of listening, paying attention, giving your full respect to people, giving people the appropriate airtime. Some of the rules of engagement that we took for granted, we've now got to embed in our virtual world of working.
Yeah, maybe building on Colleen's question over there. I mean, I think a lot of leaders and managers who are accustomed to kind of being at the office and having everyone around them have to transition to this very, really managing or leading from a distance. And, what are some of the things they have to do differently now that they're not in such close contact with people?
The first thing is, just examining the issue of trust. I find that such a big thing because you're not seeing the people anymore, right? And because you're not seeing people anymore, you've got to trust that they are doing productive work, right? So that's the first issue. The second issue is, how are you measuring people? Are you still measuring them in terms of the time they give to some project, or are you measuring them on an output? Recently I've come across the difference between KPIs and OKRs. KPIs, we know, in the traditional world of work. OKRs have to do with objectives and key results. And more organizations are exploring the objective and key results, where they break down the KPIs into manageable chunks and start measuring people around, those goals and outcomes that are very clear and distinct, and it's easily manageable. So it's around trust. It's around managing, how do you performance manage objectives. It's around getting people to work in smaller teams and collaborate in smaller teams on smaller projects so that they'll be able to be accountable to each other. But the big thing is the disposition of the leader, how the leader comes across. Can the leader, role model some of these behaviors to his team? And so when the leader says, look, I'd like you all, we're starting our session at 8 o'clock. Is the leader available at 8 o'clock, or is he busy on some other call? One of the things I found working really well, Hilton, is doing a check-in on an online meeting. A leader spends the 5-6 minutes saying, guys, how are you doing? What's happened since we last met? Can you fill us in, about COVID? How are you showing up today? What are your anxiety levels? All of that helps in online work for a leader to manage his team more appropriately and adequately.
Yeah, I think just maybe on a practical level, where check-ins used to be just part of passing each other in the corridor and seeing what's going on, leaders now have to make a very deliberate effort. You've got to, dial in or contact someone. It's a little bit different. But how often should they be doing that so that it doesn't become too invasive? And, I think it's what you were talking about earlier, was the kind of close versus distant. And, how much space should leaders be giving people just to get on with their work, or kind of giving them the support of checking in and participating and working out that, those tricky equations?
I think the earlier point I made is you can't adopt a one-size-fits-all, eh? So while you may have a team meeting on a Monday or a Tuesday morning, everybody's on, we put our microphones on, we check in, and so on. I think that the leader of any team in this time must be able to connect with individuals on a personal basis. Some people might require you to call them possibly once a week. Others might require just for you to call them just once a fortnight, just to keep in touch with them, to touch base with them. But you've got to understand your team so well that you need to be, researchers call this situation sensing. How good are you as a leader in situation sensing? Because that's one of the fundamental characteristics of a good leader. Do I know my team well enough to know whether they want me to call them every day, or they want me to leave them and call them maybe once a week? And that is a sign of a good leader.
I love that, the way that you've captured that situation sensing. What I wanted to talk a little bit more about was just when you're with someone who you've been a coaching leader, you've done the listening, you've been compassionate, and you're still not seeing the results maybe that you hoped for. At what point do you become much more directive, and how do you switch? When do you know when to switch, or do you just become permissive? Because it feels a bit like the coaching methodology is very empowering and gives people a lot of space.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, today in my session, we addressed a very similar issue, So the first thing is, a leader needs to be humble enough and needs to put aside his ego to realize that, look, I'm not making headway with this individual. The problem might be me as a leader. The problem might be me as a coach. Maybe this chemistry is not there anymore. And so it's nothing wrong in saying, look, can I get some other assistance for you? Maybe there's somebody else that might be able to assist you as a coach. And so knowing those boundaries, knowing those parameters within which you can possibly work is an important thing for a leader, right? The second thing is, when there's a fire, you're not going to coach, right? You're going to say, get out of the room now. move. So it needs for you to be forceful and authoritative at some point, but the occasion will be rare when that happens. There's more occasions for you to be able to lead people, coach them, have developmental conversations with them so that they take ownership of those decisions and it's theirs. It's Lao Tzu again around people saying we have done it ourselves. And so, I think there's a space for being directive, but the large number of occasions, it's more a coaching style of leadership that we'd like to embed in our organizations.
Brian, I wonder if I could switch tack to the Enneagram. I know you're an expert on the Enneagram. And I mean, being in the kind of assessment space as we are as a company, the Enneagram sits at the periphery of science. So it's like it's in that blurry space. It's seen more as, I guess, a bit of a novelty tool, but at the same time, it's taken seriously. I know it's used in a lot of development situations, and understanding the typology is important just in understanding individual differences. Maybe you could just give us some insight into how you use the tool and what you think of it.
I first came, or let's say the Enneagram found me. I didn't find the Enneagram. The Enneagram found me in 2012 when I went to the UCT, the Center for Coaching, to do my coaching program. And here I was given this assessment to do. I remember going through it and saying, wow, how accurate. The assessment that the Integrative Enneagram does, the Integrative 9 organization does, is one that's based on algorithms. And it's got a 98% accuracy only because it tries to dig deeper and deeper and deeper until it really gets you, right? So the Enneagram, I know, is used for personality typologies and so on. I'd rather look at it as a map for an individual for his or her own self-awareness and self-development. So recently, I've been using the Enneagram a lot, with understanding relationships, getting people to understand their teams better, getting people to understand their children better, right? And it's been a magnificent tool for self-discovery. So, the beauty of the Enneagram is that it's rooted in those three centers that we have, our thinking center, which is, our mind, feeling center, our heart, and our action center, and, our body. And all of us as human beings have all three of those centers. However, we become more at home with one of these centers. And the idea of using the Enneagram is to point out to us on which center do we really fall back on. Can we bring those centers into balance so that we can become truly integrated human beings, right? So that's on one level why I like the Enneagram. But why I also like the Enneagram is that, it kind of speaks to us about those three key instincts in our lives as human beings. So we have an instinct for self-preservation, all of us, right? We want to protect ourselves, we need things to preserve us. The second instinct we have is an instinct for one-on-one conversations, deep, intimate relationships with people. And the third instinct is a social instinct, a wanting to belong to a community, a family, a bigger group, etc. While we have all of those three instincts, one of them becomes more pronounced. And so in my case, I'm an Enneagram type 2, but I'm a social Enneagram type 2. In other words, what's more important for me is a group of people, a team, and knowing that, I'd be able to look at what are the strengths I bring to any team, to any family, to myself, what are the weaknesses I have that I need to take care of, and the Enneagram has a wonderful way of looking at where do I go to when I'm stressed, where do I go to when I'm released and not stressed? How do I take care of those triggers in my life? It just makes me a better individual, a better dad, a better leader. That's why I find the Enneagram such a powerful tool, Hilton.
Brian, earlier you spoke about how your career started, which was through learning. How do you create learning organizations now with remote work, and what has the impact been working in the space of leadership development?
Yeah, learning is a passion of mine. I started off as a teacher. I taught, secondary school students. Then I went into adult education, adult learning in the corporates. And so I've got both the child and adult learning in what's important. This is a topic for another conversation, really, Colleen. But what I can say is that never has there been a better moment for an organization to become a learning organization than it is during this time of COVID, in this pandemic. Because what it's done to us, it's given us amazing opportunities to up our learning in our organizations. Otherwise, we would have still been in our comfort zones, right? Let's to give you one practical example. Learning for many organizations has been like scheduled learning. We put them out in a training needs analysis in the beginning of the year, and we assume that people will want to know how to do decision making in October. And so we get people to want to go on that course. Now that is outdated, and what the pandemic has taught us is that we cannot do learning in that way. It's got to be, it's forced us to think differently about so many aspects of learning, right? The question is, what are we picking up what we're learning during the pandemic and building this into the next normal? I know for sure that I as a facilitator, I'm never going to go, I'm quite deliberate about this. I'm never going to be going back to the old way I facilitated programs. In workshop-based, heavy workshop-based learning where you sit in a classroom, the company pays for your travel, the company pays for your food and for the facility. I mean, that is a thing of the past. What we are going to have is a mix of online, but also face-to-face work. Face-to-face is important, guys. We cannot do everything online. We need the touch. We need to see people. We need to engage with them. And I know that the way I'm going to be shaping my offering to corporates is both online and face-to-face work. So yeah, it's revolutionized the way we're going to be doing learning in future.
Yeah, it sounds like for sure the world has changed, and the whole old order has shifted on its axis, and I guess that's one of the things, the way we learn. Brian, you spend quite a lot of time talking about the kind of dispositional aspects of leaders and character and compassion and those kind of things. And, agreed, those are really good character traits. But you also spoke about ability. And we know that effective leaders are visionary. They can look into the future. They keep their organizations relevant. Is that something that forms part of your curricula or the way that you approach development of leaders? Or is that something that you kind of bracket for them to do?
No, it is something which I'd like to build into my curriculum. I know that some people are of the view that leaders born and not made. I have a different view. I think there's leadership potential in everybody, and maybe it's this abundant spirit, that I'd like to have in my life. That in every single individual there is a leader. It's like if you take a piece of sculpture. What did the sculptor do? He didn't go in and put the piece of sculpture in the stone. No, all he did was he chiseled away and chipped away at the stone until the sculptor emerged. So it's there, it's in there. What we need to do as facilitators, as leaders, as coaches, is to keep chiseling away with wonderful questions, with creating an environment, an enabling environment for people, holding the space for them so that they can emerge as leaders. So I believe leaders can be made. And so my curriculum for leadership development is fully teaching people how you can become a strategic leader, how you can move from being just operational to become more strategic. It's a seismic shift, as one of the Harvard Business Review articles says, and we can actually teach people to make that seismic shift into becoming from operational to a strategic leader. That can be done. And so visioning, future thinking, strategic leadership are all things that can be taught to any individual.
I mean, it's interesting from a kind of assessment point of view. There's a kind of view that you need a certain level of complexity of your thinking to be able to unravel trends into the future, to be analytical and join the dots of how things are going to unwind. And there would probably be a view that like some people are equipped for that and others are going to plateau at a different level in the business. I mean, it sounds like you're saying something a little bit different, that you can really just teach anybody.
I am saying that certain people have a disposition to analytical thinking, to mathematics, right, etc. However, it can be taught. It might be more comfortable for the person who has a disposition towards mathematical and analytical thinking, right? It might be more comfortable for those people, easier to move into, right? Be passionate about it. But for those leaders, for example, let me give you finance skills as an example, right? Now, I'm not a finance person. As I grew up as a young man, I equated finances to capitalism. and I was anti-capitalist. I'm a
Right.
socialist at heart. And so what I did, I adopted a very negative attitude towards finances. It was the only subject I failed in school, accountancy, right? Now, and that disposition in me against finances and understanding financial statements had a bad effect as I grew up as a leader. I had to tell myself, you know what, I've got to change my mindset. I've got to now start learning to understand finances, learn to understand profit and loss, an income statement, key financial ratios, a cash flow statement, and I taught myself that. It wasn't a natural thing for me, but I learned it. All right. And
Right.
so, to somebody who's good in finances, this will come like child's play. To me, it's harder, but I've got to learn it, and I've learned it, and I'm pretty good at it now. You see the difference? So I still believe people have the potential to learn stuff, and given the right passion, given the right energy, given the right focus, given the right coaching, they will be able to get it.
So Brian, you spoke earlier about being an abundant spirit, and I can definitely attest to that abundance. One of the things that just really impacted me when COVID landed, you took the step to offer coaching, you got involved in initiatives to help people at no cost. And I just wanted to say it's just so inspirational to see how you respond to those situations. I have one more question to ask Brian, and that is the differences that you're seeing now around creating strategies for organizations, given how everything has changed. Is that something that you still involved with? Do companies still want to look at a strategy? Have the timelines changed? What have you noticed there?
Yeah, I think companies are asking for that, and but with a slightly different kind of angle to it. So we're looking at people, processes, systems, and technology, and in each one of those four areas, I hear companies saying, "Look, how can we reconfigure ourselves a bit differently? Let's like take each one. For example, people. What are we saying about, for example, performance management? What are we saying about loyalty to a company, retention? All of that stuff needs to be revisited in the light of what has happened to us, right? And even though we may get back to some sort of normalcy by the end of this year, hopefully, it will still demand from us, to help organizations to chart some way forward with this new way of looking at people, looking at the processes we employ in our organizations, looking at what kind of structure do we have. Do we still have this hierarchical or this smaller team structure? And finally, technology. Like what do we do about having this new kind of technology so that we don't make ourselves outdated in the market?
Good. Yeah, that's a good place, Brian, to look at wrapping it up. Hilton, any final questions, comments from yourself?
No, thanks. It's been very interesting talking to Brian. Brian, we really wish you well with all your teaching adventures and moving through Africa and doing all the exciting stuff. I'm envious, and it'll be great one day to pick up another conversation with you.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, and you're always welcome, Hilton. And thank you to
Sure.
Omnico for the wonderful opportunities they give us in terms of the coaching circles, coaching opportunities. But it's been just great working with you guys.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you very much. It was lovely to chat to you. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. We really hope you enjoyed the episode. It would help us a lot if you subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. Give us 5 stars if possible, and check out our website www.omnicore.co.za. You'll find our previous episodes and other blogs and helpful resources. And we look forward to connecting in the next episode.